All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, Kaytee, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Kaytee Gillis. Kaytee, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
You are welcome. So Kaytee is a licensed clinical social worker, psychotherapist who has been in the field for over 10 years. She specializes in working with survivors of family trauma, family dysfunction, and relationship trauma, including those who've experienced interpersonal violence and abuse. Kaytee works from a trauma-informed and attachment-based lens and uses a combination of psychotherapy techniques that are catered to the individual and the goals she creates with her clients. Kaytee, welcome to the podcast. Before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently at this moment.
So I'm originally from Northern New England, Maine to be exact. Kind of grew up a little bit in Maine and a bunch of time in Massachusetts too. So kind of just usually say New England. And then I ended up way down here in Louisiana on the other side of the country. Sometimes it feels like the other side of the world, but I'm in New Orleans currently.
Okay. What brought you to New Orleans?
So I actually went to Tulane for my master's, and it was one of those things where I just knew that I was going to stay. Like
really?
I just kind of knew. I told my mom, I was like, oh, I'm just going to go for my master's and then I'll be back. And I think we just kind of knew that wasn't going to happen. I needed a change. I wanted a change. And this was definitely a change. And it's been great.
Awesome. All right. So let's get in here. How the heck did you get into this field?
So it's so funny because when I was in elementary school, I used to always say I wanted to be a veterinarian. And sometimes I joke that maybe I should have still been a veterinarian. I love animals and that's really what I wanted to do. And then, I don't know, I went into mental health. I went into working with people instead of animals. I don't know what happened, if there was necessarily like a day that I made the switch. I think I kind of always knew that I was trying to kind of resolve my own maybe family trauma. I think a lot of therapists kind of go into the field, to kind of work through their own stuff or like to help other people, or kind of like a combination of everything. And so I think maybe it was like my own way of being like, oh, I'm going to change the world and help the world. And, and so I don't remember there being one day that I was like, okay, I'm not going to apply to vet school, but I studied psychology and then.
So it was a slow shift.
Yeah.
Right. I would agree with you that, it's my eyes watery here, that a lot of people probably get into this field to, work out their own stuff, but it's not always conscious.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
I mean, it sounds like for you, it wasn't so conscious.
Not in the beginning. Okay. And I do say, I'm sure it's different for everyone. I'm sure there are some people who, aren't in this field for that. But I think for me, it definitely, looking back, like now that I'm able to look back with the self-awareness I have now, yes, I was going in to try to help, figure out my own stuff. And yeah.
And was there a consciousness or intention surrounding trauma?
So no, I actually didn't even realize how dysfunctional my own family and upbringing was until I started my own private practice. And I started, because you always learn about things like domestic violence and family trauma, but it's always something that you learn of from a distance, where you're like, oh, those are the families that we're going to be working with as consumers. And, that happens to other people. And I was always, I didn't have any physical violence as a child or in, any of my relationships or things like that. So it was always so hard for me to even put the connection that there could have been trauma or domestic violence. And so that when I started, really private practice and then doing a lot of different jobs and stuff in the field, and then just being a lot more aware. And I was like, oh wow, nope, there was a lot of dysfunction there, and there's a lot of work to be done there. And I started doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, what type of dysfunction was there when you were growing up?
Just like a lot of like parental like the kids being like the surrogate spouse kind of thing, parental a lot of emphasis placed on the kids to have like parental emotions and things like that, like parentified child, I guess is
Mm-hmm,
the
mm-hmm,
word I usually use, or the phrase I usually use, things like that.
mm-hmm,
And just a lot of, we're gonna express our emotions loudly and through frustration, and we never really come back and kind of like close the circle kind of thing. So I never really learned how to have like appropriate boundaries and how to express things, ironically, because like I went into the mental health field, and it was interesting because like I never learned how to like have those, appropriate boundaries of like, hey, it's okay to be upset, and this is how you express that,
mm-hmm.
and this is how you do so safely and respectfully.
So you studying mental health. You went into what was the degree you were getting? A master's?
So yeah, so when I started studying, my first degree is in psychology, my bachelor's is in psych,
Okay.
and then my master's is in social work. So when I was getting my master's is when I was doing a lot of like clinical work and self-reflection and things like that.
Okay. So walk us through how things unfolded for you in terms of thinking to yourself, whoa, maybe there was stuff going on. How did that begin to happen for you? Share an experience or something.
So what happened to me is like one of my first internships or like practicums, or whatever I know they're different words regionally. I had a clinical rotation where I was doing a lot of work with families, and there were a lot of things that would come up where the treatment team would label the behavior as being dysfunctional, or the behavior as being abusive, and I'd be like, in the back of my head, and I mean I was early 20s, so the back of my head I'd be like, oh yeah, that is not normal,
Mm-hmm.
yes, that is abusive. And of course, like once I saw it through that lens, it was like, how can you ever not see that? But
Mm-hmm.
when when it's your environment and you grew up with it for so
Right.
long, it was just, yeah, it was just, the headache that I dealt with, or the headache that you deal with, rather than having a name for it as being abusive or shameful, or whatever.
So you get your master's and then you get into social work.
Mm-hmm.
How do things unfold in that sense?
So originally I started working a lot with I did some work with couples in the beginning, and I want to say I do not specialize in couples. That is a very, it's a very unique specialization. You have to specialize in couples, but I work with a lot of queer people, a lot of LGBTQ people. And so in my area, New Orleans, 10 years ago, we didn't have a lot of therapists who would be comfortable working with same-sex couples or mixed gender couples that aren't like the straight cis hetero couples
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of therapists are kind of trained and used to. And I know lots changed in 10 years, but 10 years ago in this, and it was Louisiana and all that. So a lot of people were like, okay, we have this couple and we don't know who to refer them to. We don't know who's comfortable working with them. And I was like, yeah, I'll work with them. Which is too bad that's the kind of like, you're taking the best you can get, but that's kind of what a
Mm-hmm.
lot of LGBT people deal with, is like the best you can get, kind of, unfortunately, in certain areas. And so I was working with couples, and and I started to see some of these dynamics, and not all the time, but there was one couple in particular that really stuck out with me, that I failed to notice some pretty serious domestic abuse going on. And it's not that I like failed to notice it, because it was the same kind of thing where you look at it from hindsight and you're like, oh well, duh. But it was something that I failed to call it out in time.
Okay, can you be specific?
So what happened is I remember, and I'd only met with them a few times, two men. And I say that just so I'm using he pronouns and I'm not talking about the same person. So I was working with two men, they were married, and there was definitely a lot of abuse going on. And like there's a very unhealthy dynamic, a very toxic dynamic, but one partner in particular was doing a lot of things like threatening blackmail and things like that if they were to break up. Just a lot of things that were very scary.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one day I called that out. I said, wow, I mean, a lot of this feels really scary. I would feel scared to end a relationship with someone like that. And I don't know if the partner, it kind of clicked with him, but he stormed out. And this was back in the days before COVID when you could storm out. Now it's telehealth, you just shut the computer. But but he stormed out. And I think that's when it really hit me that I was like, wow, and you go through a lot of, therapists, what was I going to do? I'm not going to wave a magic wand and have it not happen, but you go through like what could I have done? What should I have done? What could I have called it out earlier? Should I have done anything? Did I do damage by even seeing them for the 3 or 4 sessions? And not calling it out, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
so in other words, when you by the time you called it out, you mean you hadn't seen it previously during the sessions you had with them?
I had, but it was one of those things like I was new in my career, and I was, definitely not skilled a lot in working with couples. I was still getting like my clinical supervision and stuff like that. And so I would go and I would talk to my clinical supervisor about what was happening. But so much of non-physical domestic violence is like hard to put into words.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a lot easier to call it out if I were to come in and say, oh, John and Frank, John hit Frank. Now we know that that's physical abuse. Right. I've called it out. It's a black and white issue. There is really no debate, or there's no, like it's not hard to kind of describe, like it's physical abuse and you call it out.
Right.
I was struggling to kind of put words to like, I knew I felt uncomfortable and I knew that this guy was making me nervous. Not like I thought he was going to harm me, but I mean, the dynamic was very uncomfortable and I knew I could feel it.
Mm-hmm.
And my supervisor kept telling me, pay attention to that feeling that you get. But other than that, I didn't know how or, what kind of things I couldn't put my finger on it,
mm-hmm.
And now I have words for it, but I didn't then.
So at this point in time, you are, as we indicated in your bio, focusing on working with family trauma, family dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us about how you moved into that field.
So
specialization, rather.
Okay, from family dysfunction to,
or no, just how did you decide to work with these populations?
Okay, so I found that when I was looking for a therapist to do my own work, 10 plus years ago, I found that so many therapists at the time, and I do think it's switching now, but I do think so many therapists at the time really didn't understand, or kind of like you don't know what you don't know until you know it. Right. So many therapists like didn't know, the dynamics of family trauma and the dynamics, especially non-physical family trauma and the trauma that comes from being a child growing up in that kind of dysfunction. And so it was so hard to find one. And when I found one, and it was one of those things like I didn't know what I was looking for until I found her. I just knew that I was like, I don't know if people understand this, or maybe I'm the one with the problem. And I remember my therapist like really educating me and teaching me like, no, like there were a lot of dysfunctional dynamics and things like that. And you're bringing that out in your self-esteem and your self-awareness and your day-to-day stuff. And I was like, oh, yep.
And so that at that point you were like,
at that point I was like, okay, there's a huge need here. And I realized that I had, after I spent years doing my own work and stuff, I realized, there's a big need here for this. And it also is a big passion of mine. Mm-hmm. I find that when I work with clients who've had, family trauma, relationship trauma, it's like I get it, and I can kind of see the dynamics and things like that. And I feel like it's definitely a passion that I feel rewarded with. Like some people, I know one of your podcast guest, she worked with like eating disorders and things like that, and it was a real passion for her. And it's like the same kind of thing. Like I just knew when I started working with these people, I was like, okay, like there's a need here, there's a hole that I could
Mm-hmm.
fit. And
Talk
like,
more about that. So, and for the listeners here who maybe don't have that specialization
mm-hmm,
or particular knowledge, give us an insight into what you see, what is needed when you're working with that particular client. Again, people are different, but
mm-hmm.
generally speaking.
So a lot of times what happens is people will come in to me, or come into therapists in general. And I know a lot of therapists, we can relate to this, that people come in and they're like, I keep having the same problem. I keep meeting, jerks, or I keep meeting, women who treat me horribly, or people who are just, the wrong person for me. And there's this unhealthy pattern that's developing. And a lot of times when I work with these clients, it goes back to, attachment. It goes back to, what happened? Where did you learn how to have a relationship? Where did you learn how to be treated? Where did you learn how to conduct yourself as a partner or in a partnership? And we find that, yeah, there's a lot of unhealthy dynamics that were learned and exhibited and repeated and things like that. And so a lot of times clients, we work on that, and we work on, how to recognize it. And it's because it's not going to change overnight. It's not like once you say, oh yes, I had some dysfunction in the modeling of relationships when I was a child. It's not like calling it out, all of a sudden you're gonna go out into the world and have a healthier relationship. It's more of like, you start realizing, okay, and then you notice things little by little,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a lot of work and things like that. And it's hard, but
It's interesting that you say that. Um, do a lot of people, I mean, just like yourself, it's like
mm-hmm.
you don't realize, it's like the fish is in the water, doesn't
Yep.
realize it's in water.
Yep. Yep.
And with family dynamics, a lot of times people, when you point out something that is abusive or
Mm-hmm.
potentially traumatizing, that's their norm.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And so what ends up happening, and especially, and I know I always say the words non-physical, and what I mean by that is that because it is kind of a different specialty. And the reason why is because we have such a stereotype in our society about when I say the word domestic violence, or when I say the word family violence, we automatically think, I say we as society, us as clinicians, maybe not, but society automatically thinks, okay, fist raised, holes punched in walls. We think of things like that.
Right.
And it's very limited. And so a lot of times what happens is we alienate those people who maybe didn't experience that type of violence. And I'm not in any way downplaying that kind of violence. I'm not in any way trying to say it's better than or anything like that. But what ends up happening is the people who didn't experience that, they're like, oh, I didn't have family trauma, I was never hit. And that's because that's what I used to say. It's like, I didn't have family trauma, I was never hit.
Yeah, and similarly too with just trauma in general. Well, I haven't
Mm-hmm.
been to war. How could I
Mm-hmm.
have
Yes.
experienced PTSD, or haven't
Yes.
been sexually
Yes.
assaulted or been hit by a car, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, obviously you've had a history with this. I mean, personally,
Yeah.
what do you think, Kaytee, you bring to this that helps you or allows you to work with people who've also experienced this?
I think after we do a lot of like our own work of our own things that come up, like maybe our own triggers, our own, wounds and things like that need to be, I don't know if you didn't ever necessarily heal it, but kind of like stitch it up, or, heal it for some people, depending on the stuff. I think that gives me good insight into what it is that people have gone through, because a lot of times what happens is clients will come in and tell me, I feel like I'm crazy. Like, I feel like
Right.
I'm going to I'm telling the judge, or I'm telling the police, or I'm telling, my providers that this is what happened. And they're looking at me like I have three heads. Like, there's no way that happened. I mean, that story sounds really far-fetched. And it's like, no, I get it. Like, I get what you're saying. And I feel like it helps give me, that insight and it's one of those things like until you've been through it, like kind of like
Mhm.
use the example like veterans having gone through war, or or people who've been sexually assaulted. Unless a lot of times trauma is so I think it was Vesser Bandelkolk who described it as being like you're either in the club or you're out, like when he worked with like PTSD veterans, because it was like they didn't trust people who hadn't been through that kind of trauma because they were like
Right.
there's no way you could understand, which
Right.
makes sense.
Do you feel that too with the people you're working with?
I feel like yes and no. I feel like sometimes if you're an empathetic person and you're just an easy person to talk to, I feel like that's good across the board. You know what I mean? I don't feel like it's so black and white that you either understand or you don't. However, I do feel like there are times where, unless you've been through some of the, like with psychological abuse, unless you've been through it, it does seem a lot like, huh? Making
Hmm.
that up. Like there's no way it was really like that. Like that's an example. Kind of like people who've gone through, I come from a military family, and so I've, heard horrific stories, and I'm not trying to compare contrast in any way. But some of the stuff you hear, it's like there's no way that someone could hear that and be like, there's no way that could happen. You know what I mean? Like it's like hard for our brain to kind of compartmentalize those types of traumas based on like what we've gone through.
So let me just remind everyone, I'm speaking with Kaytee Gillis. Um, Kaytee's website is Kaytee, Kaytyn Gillis, GILLISLCSW. I'll have that linked up. Don't ask me to repeat that. I'll have that linked up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So you said, Kaytee, that you specialize, correct me if I'm wrong, in working with LGBTQ plus community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is there what are the unique aspects of working with that population when we're
Yes.
talking about trauma and
Yes.
specifically IPV, interpersonal violence?
Yeah. So a lot of times what happens is kind of, going back on stereotypes like or what we have a frame of reference in our society of what we consider domestic violence. And a lot of times when things go outside of that frame of reference, people have a hard time seeing it or recognizing it. So what happens is we think of domestic violence, we think of male perpetrator, female victim. That's just what society
Right.
sees it as. And while I like to think that's changing, the reality is that a lot of times, law enforcement and the courtrooms, they're a lot more traditional than, let's say, mental health clinicians. I feel like while it's changing more for us, it might not be, for those fields. So what ends up happening is a lot of my clients will find, okay, I'm not believed because I'm a man, or I'm not believed because my partner was a woman,
Mm-hmm.
or I if I go in and I say, hey, my partner was abusing me, it becomes like a political discussion about their life instead of just getting them protection.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like all these extra hurdles that they have to go through.
Now, I want to ask you this question. I want to be sensitive, but
Mm-hmm.
how do you identify?
So I identify as queer, but it's like depends on like what group I'm in. Like if I'm in like a, if I'm talking at work or in a professional table, I probably won't say the word queer, but I do identify as part of the LGBT community. However, I am privileged in that I'm straight passing, so if I go in to ask for help, for example, I'm not, I'm a woman, and I'm a
Right.
cisgendered woman. And so I still have that privilege of being a woman. I still have the privilege of being, I'm feminine and I'm straight passing. So that does give me a lot of privilege in that. Whereas a lot of my clients, they might be, maybe they're more masculine looking, or maybe they're men who are feminine looking, or maybe they're trans people. And the police will then ask questions, that are like inappropriate to the situation. And I'm not necessarily faulting the police. I'm not saying that all the police are doing that to be malicious. I do think sometimes it's a lack of understanding and awareness, and then sometimes a lack of ability too active, like what they can and can't do um within the law. But it is an extra hurdle for these people.
Do you how do you provide trainings at all for other therapists?
I do.
Okay. And before you answer, so two-part
Yeah.
question here. Do you provide trainings for other therapists? And also, do you feel it's important to, and the reason why I asked you how you identified was,
Mhm.
do you feel it's important for someone to identify as queer to then work with that population?
So it I've heard different things from different people. I've heard I have many colleagues who are trans, who are transgendered colleagues, transgendered clinicians, and they will say, look, because I'm a person of lived experience, I'm a better fit to provide therapy in like certain areas, which
Mhm.
absolutely I cannot, as a cisgendered person, I cannot, dispute that, and I respect that. Um, that being said, it's kind of like goes back to what you asked me before. I see both sides to it. I do think there are certain times that people, they don't want to have to educate their practitioner. Like I know that there are times that I'm dating a man right now, but in the past I've dated a woman. And when I go in and I say to my PCP, certain questions will come up, and it's like you have to kind of educate them, and that gets exhausting as the
Mhm.
client, or as the
Mhm.
patient. So in that area, I would say it helps, but as long as you're aware and you're um I guess aware and educated and allied, and that's usually I think the biggest thing, not necessarily.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And
Yeah.
as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, it also depends on what the client needs. And of course,
Oh,
the
for sure.
client may not know what they
For
need.
sure.
But as
Absolutely.
you're
And thank you for
talking,
saying that.
yeah, I'm also thinking that,
Yeah.
you know, we we people,
Mhm.
clients, anyone can learn so much from anyone,
Yes.
right? And it's I think it depends on one's ability
Yes.
to be really open and approach that. But at the same time, I could see where it would get or could really get exhausting having to
Hmm.
educate someone on the most fundamental of
Yeah.
aspects.
Absolutely. And I thank you for saying that too, because that's something, another thing I always say is that it depends on what the client is coming to you for. Like in my example of my colleagues who will say, like, look, I'm a person of lived experience. I'm better to do ABC. That is usually for things that are like, consultation, or things like if a patient is coming in for, support related to their gender identity or related to, medical support or medical needs. However, if I have a patient who comes into me for help with their anxiety, I mean, the only time it matters about their sexuality or their gender is when you're working with a clinician who is uncomfortable with those things. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of how to explain that better. Like, um, if you go in to see a clinician and you can tell the clinician is uncomfortable with the fact that you're a same-sex couple, for example,
Right.
then that's going to come into the therapy room.
Right.
Whereas if the clinician is not uncomfortable, then the fact that you're same-sex couple, same gender couple, might have nothing to do with why you're there.
Right. Right.
If
Appreciate
that
that.
makes sense.
It does. It does. Okay. So let's talk about how you work, what services you offer. You said you do provide trainings for other therapists.
I do. I provide
Very cool.
trainings for therapists. I provide trainings really for all healthcare personnel. I have a training on Zur Institute for intimate partner violence, and then I also provide trainings, outside of that, um, like by myself for on family trauma and intimate partner violence.
Okay. Awesome.
Mhm.
And these can be accessed what via your website?
Yeah, so I have the Zur Institute. You can just Google Zur Institute and then intimate partner violence, and my training comes up. But
Okay.
I also have a link on my website, and I have a link on my link tree, and so yeah, it's on my website, and then on my Instagram has a link tree.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll have those linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Awesome. Before you go, I want to ask you if you could share an early clinical error and
Okay.
what you learned from that.
So I think for me the biggest clinical error is probably when
Don't give me
I,
morality.
huh?
Give me a specific.
Oh, okay. I was going to use the example of the two men that I was working with where I watched one walk out, and that's really when I had that eye-opening, example of like I went to my clinical supervisor and I was like, what if I caused him damage, things like that. But I had another similar situation too when I was working with a family, and this was again during like clinical rotations, or people are, they're not really specialized yet. So I do not specialize in family therapy. That's another, area that you really should specialize in if you want to work with families. But I was like, I had to work with the family as part of my internship. And, it was the same kind of thing where there was a really unhealthy and abusive dynamic going on with one of the parents. And, the kid came in, and the kid was like the identified patient. And all the clinicians and all the treatment team were like talking about the kid and the kid's problems and things like that. And then looking back, I should have spoken up, and I should have said, no, we need, because we were working with the family, but the kid was the identified patient. And really looking back, we should have put more emphasis on what was going on, with one of the parents and the situation that was going on there, that the kid kept saying, in ways that only kids can say. They're not going to come in like you and I and be like, this is what's going on. But the kid was telling us that there was a lot of abuse going on emotionally with the father, and the treatment team was really just kind of, I don't want to say like maybe overlooking it. We were failing to see that. And that's another thing that kind of sticks with me too, and makes me want to be like, no, I can do better, and we can do better.
Appreciate that. All right. So, Kaytee, what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
So through my website, www.caitlingillislcsw.com.
Okay.
And then I have an Instagram, Clara's Voice, and it's CLARA, Clara's Voice with 2 underscores.
Okay. And you got a podcast.
Yep. And I have a podcast, Kaytee with a Y.
Awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. I love that. And Y is spelled out, which is really clever.
Yeah.
So, talk to us, Clara.
So Clara was my grandmother, and she's actually my great grandmother. And so she experienced a lot of family trauma on her side, but being a woman, a family of immigrants, she couldn't speak up about it. I mean, it was at that time, you just didn't. What happened in the home stayed in the home. Right. And so she really suffered through it. And so we had a lot of, my family had a lot of transgenerational trauma from that, from, the experiences that happened. And then of course, more experiences that happened after that and things like that. And so I just grew up kind of hearing the stories and the things that went on that people couldn't talk about. And so she kind of was an inspiration for me. Of course, she's long passed, but she's been an inspiration for me of, how I live in a time where I can talk about this kind of stuff. I live in a time where I can go on a podcast and use the word queer and talk about my trauma, and like, that's okay. Right. And that was like unheard of, for her. I mean, so I feel like, sometimes I, am her voice, or in the voice for people who couldn't speak up or can't speak up.
Awesome. I appreciate that. Well, Kaytee, you are certainly inspiring, and just really appreciate you coming on here and opening your heart and opening your soul. And I think a lot of our listeners are going to be inspired by your voice today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.